The Iranians and the Americans haven't had real diplomatic ties in decades. But how did we get to this point? The US and Israel attacking Iran, and President Trump talking about ultimate victory.
We've already won in many ways, but we haven't won enough.
The Iranian government is showing no signs of backing down either. They've appointed a new hardline supreme leader, and the country's foreign minister says he doesn't think negotiating with the Americans is on the agenda anymore.
We have a very, bitter experience of talking with Americans after 3 rounds of negotiation, and after the American team in the negotiation said itself that we made a big progress. Still, they decided to attack us.
Coming up, we'll hear from a man who spent nearly 20 years working on U.S. policy toward Iran under both Democratic and Republican administrations, including Donald Trump. From the BBC, I'm Asma Khalid in Washington, D.C., and welcome to The Global Story on YouTube. Nate, it's a pleasure to have you with us here on The Global Story. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Could you introduce yourself briefly? For those who may not know you, could you describe what your role was in the U.S. government over the years?
Yeah, thanks. I joined the U.S. government in 2007, pretty much straight out of grad school, and I kind of got thrown into Iran work. And I did Iran work basically till the summer of 2025. And so from Bush, Obama to Trump won, and then Biden and Trump again.
Well, I want to start with a recent development. In Iran, on Monday morning local time, Iranian state TV announced that the country's new supreme leader would be a man by the name of Mojtaba Khamenei, who is the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed when this war began. I presume over the years the U.S. government had intel, had a file on Mojtaba, because the former supreme leader, he was 86 years old. So I assume there had to have been an assumption that he was not going to be around for a while. I'd really appreciate hearing from you, what was the thinking within the U.S. government over the years about Mojtaba, and how much harder or easier the relationship with Iran would be if he indeed took over?
Yeah, Mojtaba, has been involved very closely, really since 2009, and he was instrumental in some of the repression involved in the Green movement on cracking down on the protesters. So he really started to develop much more of a public profile at that point. And so we've been following him pretty closely since then. At different points over the last, 10, 15 years, Khamenei has tried to make his son, as a potential replacement for him, but it often ran into a lot of scrutiny and criticism internally. Even a few days ago, I was like, there's no way, there's too many obstacles. So, really,
And what were the obstacles? When you say internally, there was some skepticism about him, even you're saying from amongst the Iranian leadership.
Yeah, exactly. The whole Islamic Republic was breaking with the monarchy and hereditary rules. So, right, this idea of having this hereditary follow-up to the father, Ali, is something that I think is quite unpopular with Iranians. And so I think that's part of it. Second, he doesn't really have the clerical credentials, nor did his father, but he doesn't really have the clerical credentials in place to be the supreme leader as it's envisioned. And then he's just quite controversial. He is in many ways a more hardline version of his father, less willing to be, in theory, pragmatic. Like I said, the role in the crackdown. And he also has some of these corruption scandals following him. I think Bloomberg did a really good expose recently on his series of luxury properties around Europe, including the UK. So he's a very controversial character, and I think it only would take these unique circumstances to get him in power.
So as we're taping this conversation, we're looking at a situation in Iran, in the region broadly, that appears to be escalating. There is a rising death toll in Iran. We've seen people killed across the region. We've seen multiple U.S. service members who've been killed. And we also just mentioned that the country now has a new supreme leader who seems like a hardliner. And you have spent your career at the State Department working on Iran, also working on diplomacy. The State Department is inherently the diplomatic arm of the U.S. government. And so I'm wondering, do you think that, given everything I just described, that there is a scenario in which this all indeed ends at a negotiating table?
What's your time frame for that?
That didn't sound promising. Yeah.
I don't think in the short term there'll be an off-ramp at the negotiating table. I think if you're looking at this from Iran, I think so. The U.S., Israel, and Iran are all looking at this from different perspectives.
Okay.
So I think if you're Israel, I mean, they've been pretty clear that their goal is regime collapse, and
And that hasn't happened yet.
it hasn't happened yet, but we'll see where this goes. I think the U.S. goal is much more opaque, right? I mean, Trump's had he's regime change, it's regime degradation, it's I want to pick the new supreme leader. It's kind of changes by the day. So I think he would like a negotiated outcome. And he said, Mojtaba is not an acceptable outcome last week, which is kind of an interesting statement. But if I'm Iran right now, I understand why they wouldn't want to talk, right? So they've had bad interactions with the president, basically where they feel like they negotiated in good faith or not. We can talk more about that, whether that's accurate or not. But from their perspective, they did. And then, they've been bombed twice.
You're talking about last summer.
And before that, in the first Trump administration, obviously they pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated by President Obama. But if I'm Iran, I don't just unilaterally stand down like I did in June. You probably want to inflict so much damage on President Trump that he doesn't want to, and he won't let Israel do this again.
To your point on what the Iranians want, it also struck me that over the weekend we heard the Iranian foreign minister on NBC's Meet the Press, and he seemed to reject any calls for a ceasefire, felt that Iran ought to keep fighting. He does not seem ready to go to the negotiating table yet.
I think that's right. I think for Iran, I mean, the short-term objective is to make this a war of attrition, which is not something the U.S. likes to do, and just draw out pain as long as possible. Long-term, though, to your question, I mean, at some point, Iran has to come back and talk to the U.S. and Israel, or the U.S. specifically in the future, but I don't see that happening in the short term.
What's your definition of short-term and long-term?
I think Iran does not want to negotiate with the Trump administration again. So that's
a
3
long
years.
time.
Maybe there's some small transactional deal, there's some ceasefire.
But you don't think the Iranians want to negotiate with this Trump
No,
administration?
I don't think they do. Yeah, I think they've tried it and it's failed, and I think they are all in on conflict, helping to reset the playing field, which is quite scary.
So if you don't think this is ending at a negotiating table
In the short term.
in the short term,
Yeah.
where do you see this going? I mean, you're talking about what?
So
3 more years of
yeah, okay.
actual active war.
Right. So that hopefully not that. So
Feels really disheartening for so many people in the region.
it does. So I guess in my view, so Iran's not looking for the off ramp. So Trump will have to make a decision. I think in the next couple of weeks, he'll basically have to have one of 3 options. He'll either have to back down and just kind of walk away. I mean, he can still declare victory, and he has some valid things he can claim. He killed Khamenei the father. Iran's military is degraded. Like, that's the narrative he can do as success and try to walk away. But like I said, I don't think Iran will take that. So basically, in return for that, he basically needs to follow through on a ceasefire from June, where he basically makes it so that neither Israel nor Iran can have hostilities. And so he has to basically ensure a ceasefire happens. So that's a very, very risky move for an American president, to restrain Israeli freedom of action. And so he did that last June. But will he do that for an extended period of time? I don't know. Okay, so that's option 1. Option 2 is he has to double down on the war, and then that could potentially mean ground troops into.
And that's not popular at all here.
It's not. No, it's not. I mean, there's certainly some people, but yeah, it's extremely unpopular. Going into this war, I think it was 72% of Americans were opposed to the intervening in Iran. So I don't think it's a likely option, but you never know with President Trump. He might consider it. So I think that's his second option. And the third one that seemed increasingly likely at the end of last week was this idea of kind of outsourcing the war by arming ethnic separatist groups and ethnic opposition. So this is the idea,
Kurds,
the Kurds, yeah, and also the Baluchis. And so that, I think, is a very cynical approach, because you're basically just, by doing that, you're just kind of trying to engulf Iran into this civil war, but it has huge implications, and in my mind is far and away the worst outcome for a variety of reasons. But I mean, the fact that the president's backing off that a little bit and saying he won't arm the Kurds or doesn't support it is maybe makes that less prevalent, but it certainly seemed, at least last Friday before he said that, as like the most likely option.
Well, Nate, a major reason I wanted to have you on our show is because you spent so many years working on Iran at the State Department, also in the White House there under the National Security Council. And I think in order to understand where we are in this moment and the complete breakdown, we're saying, of diplomacy at this moment in time, of a negotiated settlement, at least at this moment, I think it is worthwhile to understand the US-Iran relationship, which has been problematic for several decades. There is no diplomatic relationship. We're not going to go all the way back to
Yeah, okay.
1979, but we want to start with much of what you've witnessed firsthand in government. And I'll start in 2015.
Okay.
That was 8 years into your career at the State Department. It is also the year, 2015, in which the Obama administration signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, what most people know as the Iran nuclear deal. So I want to talk about that, but first, can you just remind us what the deal itself actually was?
Yeah, the deal itself was a set of very in-depth constraints on Iran's nuclear program in return for a very specific set of sanctions relief. But a more basic way of thinking about it is it basically did two things on each side, or there was hope that it would do two things on each side. So for the U.S., we got a very clear constraints on Iran's nuclear program that we felt good about. I think.
And what were those?
They were limited to a very low level enrichment, 3.67% for 10 or 15 years, a very small stockpile of enriched uranium they could keep, and they couldn't do any research and development for a set part of the time. So the idea was you're buying 15 years where Iran's breakout timeline, the time it would take to get a nuclear weapon, was about a year. And so right now that breakout timeline is very, very short. I mean, it's potentially a couple of weeks or days at this point. So, I mean, you were buying yourself time that if you ever saw Iran trying to break out.
And I just want to be clear, when you say breakout time, you mean time in order to actually have a functioning nuclear weapon.
Yeah. So when people talk about having a breakout, that is a decision that has been made by their political leadership to go for a nuclear weapon as fast as possible.
And so you're saying at that time period, if the Iranian government chose to go and pursue a nuclear weapon, they would have been about a year's away.
Yes,
1
correct.
year away. You also mentioned that right now the breakout point, the point is really, really tight.
Right.
They could do that, you said, in just a couple
A couple
of
days,
weeks.
a couple days, a couple weeks, yeah.
What's the evidence for that? I asked that in part because the Trump administration had told us after the 12-day war last year that
Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
But they didn't touch the highly enriched uranium. So to measure someone's ability to break out, it's the material and it's the ability to actually turn it into a weapon.
Okay.
And so the JCPOA was focused on both, but primarily on the material they needed.
the enriched uranium.
The enriched uranium. All right. So what the Trump administration did in their June strikes is we took
Which was
out
June of last year.
June of last year, 2025, is they took out the sites. They took out a lot of the centrifuges involved with this, but what they did not really touch was the highly enriched uranium that was already there.
Because it was underground.
Because it was underground and it was in a different location than some of these other places. And so what you have left over is basically the equivalent of enough highly enriched uranium for somewhere between 9 and 11 nuclear weapons. So that HEU is still there. Now, Iran would have to basically then take that material and put it in a centrifuge and spin it a little more, but that's something that could hypothetically be done quickly, and that requires us to know where all their centrifuges are, and we don't.
So you were saying that's part of what the U.S. got was were these controls on the amount of enriched uranium. What else did the U.S. get, and what did Iran get?
Okay, so the U.S. got the controls. The other thing that I think we were hoping for it was a gamble, right? It was a 15-year gamble that over the course of this deal, the change in U.S.-Iran relationship would fundamentally alter, right? It never really got tested. We pulled out of the deal within 2 years. But that was the second hope. For Iran, basically, they got one thing and were hoping for one other thing. They got full oil sales, right? So basically, they were able to sell their oil with no restrictions. And where that was a big change. They were previously selling about 1 million barrels a day, and then after the JCPOA, they could sell 2.6 million barrels a day. So, it's a significant difference. But I think what Iran was hoping for and didn't receive was, investment into their economy, foreign investment. And that never really materialized, partially because it was a short deal, partially because, people were hesitant to invest because they saw our looming political transition, but also because Iran's a very hard place to work. And so even though we made this nuclear deal, they're still doing lots of other bad things at the time. And so I think that,
like what?
They had proxies, that had a significant role in what was happening in Yemen and Lebanon at the time. Obviously, they had proxies, in Israel and the West Bank and Gaza. So, I mean, as a foreign investor, I mean, yes, there was some part of it. This was the U.S., but primarily it was Iran's fault.
And you were not involved in negotiating the Iran nuclear deal,
No,
correct? But
correct.
you were involved in implementing.
Right.
And can you help us understand what does it mean to be involved in implementation?
Yeah, sure. So what that meant formally under the JCPOA was you would have a quarterly meeting where the P5+1 would get together, which is the 5 members of the Security Council plus Germany plus Iran.
All people
plus
who had
the
signed
EU.
on to that.
All
Iran
people who
nuclear
signed
deal.
on the deal would meet every quarter, and you would go through the quality of implementation
Where would you guys meet?
in Vienna and New York during the UN timeframe, but otherwise Vienna. And
Can you give us a sense of that? What was it like? It was you all would meet with the other countries that
you
were
would
part of
sit in this
deal.
like U-shaped table. There was like this massive table, 5 or 6 from each country, and it was a lot of talking points back and forth that weren't terribly useful. But the real value of it came after the meetings, where you would actually have these sit downs with Iran and the U.S. just one-on-one, and you would talk about the broader issues. It was a real conversation. It was candid, and I think it would go beyond just the nuclear details into the broader foreign policy. So it's a conversation you should be having with them. Now, did it make fundamental changes in either of our policies? Not necessarily, but at least you could have a real conversation, a candid conversation, and try to make progress.
And what were the Iranians like? I mean, did they seem like they were operating in good faith, the Iranian counterparts?
Yes. That was a long hesitation.
Yeah, you're thinking about it.
I'm
Okay.
thinking about it. I mean, you kind of know what you're going to get with the Iranians, where they're always going to push for the maximum while trying to give the minimum, if you will. And so they spent a lot of time, especially in those Obama times, saying, the U.S. need to be doing more to like promote foreign investment. And so it was frustrating encounters, but I don't think it was bad faith. It was just them pushing for the maximum and generally being just kind of difficult to deal with.
So if we fast forward, Donald Trump is in the White House. It's his first term as president, and he does what he promised he would do during the campaign. He pulls the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal.
This was a horrible, one-sided deal that should have never, ever been made. It didn't bring calm, it didn't bring peace, and it never will. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
So if we fast forward a couple of years, Joe Biden wins the election in November of 2020. And initially, his administration does try to revive the Iran nuclear deal. You end up actually joining the National Security Council. You handle the Iran file as the Iran director for the Biden administration, right? And the National Security Council. And there seemed to be this focus on, I remember at the time, actually, I was reporting, I was a White House correspondent, there were these moments of, there's these talks and something might develop. Nothing actually did end up developing. It all fizzled out. And I want to understand, you were there at the time that this was all happening. Why did it not go anywhere?
A number of reasons. I think most of them are Iran's fault, but we maybe made a few as well on the U.S. side. I think we got really close to a deal in the spring of 2022. But then the war broke out with Russia and Ukraine, and that kind of hit pause on everything as well for several months, especially as Iran started upping their support to Russia in that conflict. And so all of this kind of stalled out the Iran negotiations for understandable reasons. And then even still, we were willing to go back into the deal at the end of summer 2022. But Iran, changed the terms on the deal again. They just, I think, had this misperception they could get a better deal. And at this point, this was just no longer viable. And so
But by the end of 2022, it was done.
Yeah, pretty much. And Iran had made so much progress in their nuclear program in that intervening period that the terms of the JCPOA no longer worked anyway, right? The break-up timeline was much shorter just because their program had advanced so much during the time when Trump pulled out to then.
So in early 2025, we have a new president, Donald Trump again, re-enters the White House, and you had left the National Security Council. And at some point, you're pulled back into Iran negotiations with the Trump administration. Is that right? And can you help me understand what was that like and what was the thinking?
Yeah. Once the negotiation started, basically, the Steve Witkoff and his team kind of reached out and said, hey, we're putting together an Iran negotiating team. Would you be part of it? And I said, sure.
And what does that mean that you were working on the negotiations?
Well, I mean, that's a good question.
Because I think a lot of people would be surprised to think that there was ever an effort to negotiate. I mean, there was, they thought, but then it sort of fizzled out after.
So there ended up being 5 rounds of talks last spring and summer,
Yeah.
and so Steve was at all of them. You know, they were really only deployed us as a full group to a negotiation once, and so there was a lot more done back in D.C.
When you were working on the negotiations on the back end, were you helping to devise what the terms ought to be? I mean,
Giving them options, right?
Giving them options.
So
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't really clear exactly at that time what the president's objectives were, and it basically, you know, it took a while for the president to decide what he wanted. And I think he ultimately sided on the Iran shouldn't be able to enrich, which would have been, you know, just shortly before the June war happened at this point.
Were there any moments in the spring of last year that could help us understand how Trump was engaging with Iran this time around?
Yeah. So after the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, Iran refused to meet directly with the U.S. again. I mean, there's some small caveats to that, but that was basically their posture. So what happened is you had just this incredibly dysfunctional process of indirect negotiations with Iran. And so really for the last couple of years of the Biden administration, you still had a number of periodic engagements with Iran where we would go to Oman. It was kind of a broader conversation.
Meeting directly with the Iranians.
Indirectly with the Iranians. You would go
Indirectly with
sit
the
in a glass box in Muscat. The Iranians would sit in a glass box about 100 meters apart. You would look at each other through these glass boxes, and the Omanis would walk back and forth trying to pass messages. I mean, it's hard to conceive of a less effective way of doing meaningful diplomacy than that. And that is, you know, Iran's fault. You know, so this trend.
They refused to meet directly? Or?
Yeah. This is not a U.S. thing. This
Directly
is like the lack of flexibility for Khamenei, right? And so maybe this is where the opportunity. I mean, he basically, as we understand it, basically told his team, you cannot meet directly with them, but if you want to go talk to them, fine. You just can't meet directly with them. Have an intermediary go back and forth. So they used the Omanis, and, you know, I think the Omanis did the best they could, and were trying to, you know, push things forward. But they.
And was that the same situation, the glass boxes you
Yeah.
described during the Biden years? That carried over?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that's not a good situation. And so it's like really ineffective. Now, look, I think it's gotten a little better, I think, to Steve Witkoff's credit, where he's been able to have at least these short interactions with the foreign minister Arachi on Iran's side. But for the most part, yeah, you're in these like glass boxes that could not be less conducive to actually getting anything done.
Now, you left the U.S. government last summer.
Yeah.
Many people have left the State Department after working on, you know, a series of special area issue expertise. And I want to understand how the negotiations are unfolding nowadays. Are there experts still in the room who understand the region? I mean, Steve Witkoff's a real estate man. Jared Kushner's largely a real estate guy as well.
So, I mean, they tried to incorporate people. And I think every special envoy seems to have, there are experts still in the room, I think. But I think the key trait is that the president really only trusts a few people, right? So there's only, the inner circle for President Trump is so small, right? It's just a few special envoys that he trusts. You know, it's Witkoff, it's Kushner, it's Barrack, it's Rubio, it's Vance. I don't know if there's anyone else. Right. And so unless you have access into one of those very, very small networks of people, you basically aren't doing anything at all.
In the past several months, I know you were not working inside the U.S. government, but as you were watching the latest round of negotiations unfold, did war seem inevitable to you?
It did. One reason is, I think, when Prime Minister Netanyahu went to see the president at the end of December, he basically got carte blanche to attack Iran anytime, anywhere on their missile program. And so at that point, if you're Iran, you know conflict's coming again, and you know that the missiles are your only line of defense that matter at this point. So that means that Iran's going to keep producing them. So that means that Israel or the U.S. is going to need to basically hit Iran every 6 months.
I just want to understand what you're saying, though, about this feeling inevitable to you, because nonetheless, his team was in active negotiations with the Iranians.
Right.
And so what were they trying to get? I mean, we heard from Trump administration officials who briefed reporters afterwards saying that, you know, Iran wasn't serious about this, their take. Nonetheless, they were sitting down to talk.
They were. All right. So, but my point is here. So I think at this point, Iran has calculated that attack is inevitable. And so they basically, what we saw in the last couple rounds of negotiations was zero flexibility.
From Iran.
From Iran, right? I mean, Iran has decided no matter what happens, we're going to be intact. So why even bother with actually having like a really significant or serious conversation? And what was ultimately put on the table, like the day of the attacks, was significantly worse than the JCPOA and significantly smaller. And I think this was ultimately
from the Trump administration. You're saying?
From the Iranians. Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, the Trump administration was asking for 1,000 times more. And
so both, I mean, you would say we're
nowhere even in the close to the same
from
ballpark.
A point of like
not even in the same universe. And I think, Steve Witkoff said in an interview with someone, Fox News or something, that, the president was surprised that Iran didn't capitulate. But it was the opposite, right? Iran actually decided an attack was inevitable and decided to show no flexibility. I think that was fundamentally a misreading of how Iran was going to operate. I mean, Khamenei was willing to die a martyr rather than capitulate to the U.S., and so the negotiations were never close to happening. So, yeah, I felt like it was 100% inevitable.
Nate, you have worked on Iran for many years under different presidents, be they Republican or Democrat. Is there a strategy that you saw over your years of working in the State Department under a president or administration that you thought was strategically wise? I mean, look, here we are having this conversation. Nobody's strategy has actually led to a better result, but I wondered if there was a time.
I'm biased on this. I mean, obviously, I think, that investment in diplomacy is worth it just because the alternatives are bad. And so obviously, Obama invested the most in this, and it obviously was probably not really a political winner for him. But ultimately, I do think, you want to avoid wars like the one we're having right now. And look, to be fair to Trump, I mean, he is expressed interest in it as well. Iran just can't not seem to adjust to him personally, and I do think that is partially on Iran.
But are you suggesting that President Trump would be open and has historically been open to meeting with the leadership of Iran directly?
Absolutely. He's been very clear about this. And I don't even think it matters who he would meet with. I think he'd meet with the president, he'd meet with the supreme leader, he'd meet with the foreign minister.
And what's your understanding of why the Iranians do not want to meet with him?
It fundamentally was because of Ali Khamenei just refusing to engage or letting anyone engage with him, right? So fundamentally, Khamenei distrusted Trump, loathed Trump, and so that, I think, was a pride issue, an ideology issue, and was ultimately a massive mistake by the Iranian government and a miscalculation by Khamenei himself.
Well, thank you, Nate. Thanks for being so generous with your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
That's all from us today here at The Global Story. If you liked what you heard, I've got to mention that our show, The Global Story, is also available as an audio podcast. You can find us on bbc.com or wherever you listen. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you again soon.